In the vibrant city of Delta, Nigeria, lived two young children, Toby and Tina, whose lives were filled with excitement, love, and joy. Toby, an energetic 8-year-old boy, and his little sister Tina, who was 7, enjoyed the most wonderful childhood one could imagine. They lived in a luxurious home at the top of a sleek, modern high-rise that touched the sky. The family had everything they could dream of: spacious rooms, beautiful views, and all the latest gadgets. It was a world of endless possibilities, filled with gadgets that beeped, lights that changed colors, and screens that flickered with bright, colorful images. Their parents, Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo, were pioneers in the world of real estate and luxury design. They had spent years perfecting the art of blending African cultural features with cutting-edge modern architecture. The city of Delta was their canvas, and their masterpieces, high-rise buildings and smart homes, dotted the skyline like jewels, glistening under the sun. They were well known and highly respected in the business world, with their designs not only bringing luxury but also technological innovation to every project they touched. Mr. Adebayo's phone always buzzed with messages from clients, while Mrs. Adebayo was constantly sketching new ideas or overseeing projects with her team. They loved their work and it brought them great success, but sometimes it meant that Toby and Tina had to entertain themselves. Despite the hectic schedules, they always made sure to give their children a life filled with love and happiness, even if they couldn't always be around. Toby and Tina's favorite part of the day was when they were allowed to play in the high-tech playroom. The room was filled with interactive toys that responded to their voice commands, and virtual reality games that made them feel like they were on adventures in outer space or deep under the sea. The walls were screens that transformed into whatever they wanted: a jungle filled with exotic animals, a magical kingdom, or even a futuristic city where they were the heroes. They loved the technology, but more than that, they loved the freedom to dream and explore. The two children also loved the family's weekends. Every Saturday, Toby and Tina's parents would take them out to explore the wonders of the city. They would visit the local markets, where the bright colors of fruits and vegetables filled the air with a warm and inviting scent. There, they would eat fresh, delicious foods and hear the stories of the people who had lived in Delta for generations. Sundays were spent in their luxurious home, where they'd all gather to watch movies or enjoy the wide variety of activities the house's smart technology offered. Despite the modern world they lived in, their parents had always made sure to keep them grounded in their roots. The Adebayo family celebrated their culture with joy, whether through music, dancing, or learning about the history of their heritage. The walls of their home were decorated with traditional African art, and Toby and Tina were proud to know the stories behind the beautiful paintings and sculptures. Their parents had made it clear that while they could enjoy all the modern luxuries, they should never forget who they were and where they came from. For Toby and Tina, life was one big, happy adventure, filled with love and laughter. They had no worries, no fears, and the world seemed like a place of endless wonder. The Adebayo home was a place of peace and comfort, where every day brought new possibilities and new joys. The only thing they could have wished for was more time with their parents. Time to play, time to talk, time to enjoy each other's company. But despite their busy lives, Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo always made sure to make their children feel special. But even in the happiest of families, things can change. Sometimes, it only takes a small moment to unravel everything. Toby and Tina had no way of knowing it, but something was about to happen that would shake their world in ways they couldn't yet understand. For now, though, their life remained a picture of happiness, a perfect blend of modern technology, family love, and African tradition. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet tension building, one that no one could yet see. It would be a day of change, a day they would never forget. It was just another normal day in the Adebayo household. The sun had set, casting an orange glow across the skyline of Delta, and the soft hum of the city below blended with the quiet buzz of the high-tech gadgets in the home. Toby and Tina had just finished playing in the spacious, futuristic playroom. They were laughing, their faces glowing with joy, as they had just completed a virtual reality race together. They spent the next few minutes talking about what new games they could try next. Upstairs, the parents had decided to take a well-deserved break. After a long week of dealing with tight deadlines, meetings, and endless phone calls with clients, Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo decided they needed some time to themselves. The kids were preoccupied in their playroom, and the house was designed to be self-sufficient, so they knew they could relax for a while. Toby and Tina, however, hadn't been paying much attention to their parents. They were too busy competing in their virtual games, their minds full of excitement. But as they went to the window to look out over the city, something unusual caught their attention. The noises coming from their parents' room were different today. Strange sounds, not the usual ones they heard when their parents were talking or laughing. At first, the children couldn't make sense of it. "What is that sound?" Tina whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. Toby, ever the curious one, stood up looking toward their parents' bedroom door. "I don't know, but I think we should check it out." Tina hesitated for a moment, her tiny hands gripping the edge of the windowsill. "But what if they're busy?" Toby, always ready for an adventure, grinned. "That's what makes it exciting. We can just peek. They won't even notice." And so, with the quiet stealth of young explorers, Toby and Tina crept through the hallway of their home. They moved silently, trying not to make a sound, even though their hearts were racing with excitement. They were used to getting into little mischief, but this felt different. The odd sounds coming from the bedroom made everything seem mysterious. What could it be? They reached the door to their parents' room. It was slightly ajar, just wide enough for them to slip through. Holding their breath, Toby slowly pushed the door open just enough for them to peek inside. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp on the nightstand, and through the crack in the door, they could see their parents sitting on the bed. They looked like they were having some sort of quiet conversation, but something was off. Suddenly, they saw their parents having sex for the first. It was strange and unfamiliar. Toby and Tina's eyes widened in confusion as they tried to make sense of what was happening. They were both silent, watching in disbelief, not sure if they should laugh, cry, or scream. Toby's mind raced with questions. What are they doing? He thought to himself, unsure of what exactly he was seeing. He had never seen his parents act like this, and it felt strange to be watching them. Tina, still confused, clutched Toby's hand tightly. She had no idea what was going on, but she knew this was not the kind of thing they were supposed to see. Her heart beat fast and her mind was full of questions. Was this normal? Were they in trouble? The noise from the room continued, and both children were too curious to move. They had never seen their parents so close, so different. What was going on in there? Were they supposed to be doing this? The sounds were getting louder and they didn't know how to feel. Should they leave? Should they tell someone? But before they could decide, the door suddenly creaked, and their parents turned around in surprise. The shock on their faces was instant. Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo quickly sat up, adjusting their clothes, their faces flushed with embarrassment. They had no idea their children had been watching. Toby and Tina froze, staring back at their parents with wide eyes. The room was silent except for the faint sounds of the city outside. Mr. Adebayo spoke first, his voice shaky. "Toby, Tina, what are you doing here?" Tina quickly backed away from the door, her face turning red. We heard noises," she stammered, feeling ashamed for having seen something she didn't understand. Mr. Adebayo stood up and walked over to them, trying to calm the situation. "Listen, kids, this is something that's private. It's not something you're supposed to see. You understand, right?" Toby and Tina nodded, though they were still unsure about everything that had happened. They didn't understand what their parents had been doing, but the look on their faces told them it was something serious, something they were not supposed to know about. Mrs. Adebayo, now standing by her husband, cleared her throat, her face filled with discomfort. It's okay. You didn't mean any harm. But we need to talk about boundaries. Some things are just for adults." Toby and Tina, their curiosity unsatisfied but overwhelmed by the situation, both mumbled their apologies and quickly ran back to the playroom. The door closed softly behind them, but the questions remained unanswered. What had they just witnessed? What did it all mean? The two children sat on the floor of the playroom, their minds racing with confusion and curiosity. They didn't understand everything they had seen, but one thing was clear. The world of grown-ups was more mysterious than they had ever imagined. And they had just crossed a line they couldn't take back. Tina looked at her brother, her face pale. "Toby, do you think we did something bad?" Toby, still deep in thought, shook his head slowly. "I don't know, Tina. But I think we need to forget what we saw." But it wasn't that easy. What they had just discovered would change everything. The days that followed were filled with awkward silences and a strange tension hanging in the air. Mr. and Mrs. Adebayo tried their best to act normal, but there was an unspoken heaviness between them and their children. Toby and Tina couldn't help but think about what they had witnessed in their parents' room. They didn't fully understand what was going on, but the images in their minds wouldn't go away. Every time they saw their parents, they felt a sense of unease, as if they were all standing on the edge of something they couldn't explain. Toby, being the more inquisitive one, couldn't stop asking questions. He was confused and frustrated. Why had their parents reacted so strongly? Why had they been doing that? He wanted to understand, but he didn't know who to turn to. He didn't feel comfortable talking to his parents about it, not after the way they'd scolded them. And Tina, as usual, was quiet. She hadn't said much since the incident, her thoughts swirling like a storm in her head. A few days passed before something happened that would change the course of events forever. It was late in the afternoon and the house was quiet. Their parents were busy in the office, talking to clients over video calls, while Toby and Tina were left to their own devices. The two of them were in the playroom again, but this time it didn't feel like a fun adventure. The toys and gadgets seemed less exciting, their flashing lights and sounds only adding to the tension that seemed to hang over everything. Toby paced around the room, his mind racing. He was too curious to just forget what had happened, too restless to let it go. He had to know more. But how could he find out? I have an idea, Toby said suddenly, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Tina looked up at him, unsure. What do you mean, Toby? She asked hesitantly. We can try it ourselves. Like they did, Toby said, speaking slowly as he thought it through. We saw them do it, so we should know how it feels. Tina's eyes widened with uncertainty. But what if it's bad? What if we're not supposed to? Toby shrugged. We won't know unless we try. We'll just do it like they did. It can't be that hard. Despite her worries, Tina couldn't deny that she was curious. The images from that day were still fresh in her mind, and she couldn't stop thinking about them. There was something intriguing, something mysterious about what they had seen, and part of her wanted to understand it better. I guess. Maybe we should, Tina said, still unsure but willing to follow her brother. The two children awkwardly positioned themselves in the playroom, copying the sex movements they had seen their parents make. Didn't feel right, not at all. They felt confused and uncomfortable, not understanding the purpose of the act or what it meant. Their attempts were clumsy, lacking the grace and understanding that came with experience. Toby tried to remember the details, but everything felt wrong. It didn't feel like the joy and excitement of their usual games. It felt hollow and confusing. They were both silent, trying to mimic the actions from memory, but nothing felt like it made sense. It was almost as if their bodies didn't know what to do. They couldn't shake the feeling that something important was missing, that they weren't supposed to be doing this. But they couldn't explain why it felt so strange. After a few uncomfortable minutes, they both stopped. The room was silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. Toby sat on the floor, his legs crossed, his hands resting on his knees. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. Why had they done it? What had they been hoping to learn? What had they expected to feel? Tina, sitting beside him, stared blankly at the floor. Her face was pale and she didn't know what to say. She felt confused and, in a way, a little afraid. They had crossed a line they didn't fully understand, and now it felt like everything was different. Toby finally broke the silence. I don't think we should have done that, Tina. It didn't feel right. Tina nodded, her voice barely a whisper. Yeah, it didn't. The two children sat in the playroom, the weight of their actions sinking in. It wasn't fun, it wasn't exciting, and it definitely wasn't something they had expected. What had they been thinking? They didn't know what to do with the feeling of discomfort that was now swirling inside them. But before they could process everything, the door to the playroom suddenly swung open. Standing there was their mother, Mrs. Adebayo, her face stern and serious. Toby and Tina froze, their hearts leaping into their throats. They hadn't expected her to walk in, not now, not after everything that had happened. Toby, Tina, Mrs. Adebayo said, her voice calm but with a hint of concern. What's going on in here? Toby's stomach twisted in knots. He couldn't look his mother in the eye. He felt exposed, ashamed. We were just playing, he said, his voice shaky. It wasn't a lie, not entirely, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Mrs. Adebayo stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. She looked at the two of them, her expression unreadable. Playing, she repeated softly. Is that what you call this? The silence in the room was suffocating. Toby wanted to say something, to explain that they hadn't known what they were doing, that they were just curious, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't explain it to her, not in a way that would make sense. His mind was too tangled and the fear of her reaction held him back. Mrs. Adebayo didn't say anything at first. She just stood there looking at them both with a mixture of disappointment and concern. Her eyes softened as she looked at her children, but the sadness in them was unmistakable. "You need to understand something, kids," she finally said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "What you saw the other day wasn't something for you to learn from. It's not something children should be exposed to. It's an adult matter, something that requires maturity and understanding. What you did just now, this is not something you should have tried. Do you understand?" Toby and Tina nodded, their faces flushed with shame. They hadn't expected this, hadn't known how to handle it. Their mother's words cut through them like a sharp blade, leaving them feeling exposed, confused, and deeply unsure about everything. "I don't know what to say, Mom," Toby whispered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know what it was." Mrs. Adebayo sighed, her face softening as she knelt down to their level. "I know you didn't understand, sweetheart. But it's important that we learn boundaries. Some things are not for us to explore yet." The room fell silent again. Toby and Tina looked at their mother, their minds filled with questions they couldn't voice. Everything felt different now, like the world they knew had suddenly become much more complicated. And as Mrs. Adebayo hugged them both gently, they couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed forever. In the days that followed, the weight of what had happened lingered over Toby and Tina like a thick fog. They tried to go back to their regular routines, playing their favorite games, watching their favorite shows, but nothing seemed quite the same. Their minds kept drifting back to that strange day, when they had crossed a line they didn't fully understand. They could feel the tension in the air every time their parents were around. The once joyful, carefree atmosphere of their home had changed. It was as if a piece of innocence had been lost and they didn't know how to get it back. Their parents, despite their words of explanation, seemed different too. Mr. Adebayo was still as busy as ever, constantly attending to calls from clients or reviewing blueprints. Mrs. Adebayo, who used to spend more time playing with the children, now seemed more distant, caught up in her own thoughts. Toby and Tina felt like they were drifting farther apart from their parents, as if they were living in separate worlds now. The happy family they had once known seemed to be slipping away, replaced by an awkward silence they didn't know how to fix. One evening after dinner, Toby sat in his room staring out the window at the city lights. His thoughts were clouded with confusion and curiosity. He couldn't stop thinking about what he and Tina had tried to do, the strange, uncomfortable experiment that had left them both with more questions than answers. The memory of their parents' reactions still stung, but a part of him still didn't understand why it was wrong. Why had they been so upset? What was it that they didn't get? He looked over at Tina, who was sitting quietly on her bed, lost in thought as well. She hadn't spoken much in the last few days, but Toby knew she was still thinking about what had happened. They hadn't talked about it directly, but they didn't need to. The unease between them was all too clear. "Tina," Toby said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you think we did something really bad?" Tina looked up from her bed, her face reflecting the same uncertainty Toby felt. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I don't think we should have tried to do it. Not like that." Toby nodded slowly, feeling the guilt weigh down on him. But at the same time, a new feeling was beginning to take root inside him. It was a feeling of rebellion, a need to understand, to push beyond the limits that had been set for him. He didn't know what it was yet, but it felt like an itch he couldn't scratch. "I think we need to understand it better, Tina," he said after a long pause. "We need to figure out what it really is so we're not so confused. Maybe we can find out, without anyone knowing." Tina's eyes widened. "Toby, are you sure that's a good idea? What if we get in trouble again?" Toby shook his head, determined. "We won't get caught this time. We'll be careful." The temptation to understand was too strong for Toby to ignore. He knew that Tina wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea, but he had always been the more adventurous one. He could feel the weight of curiosity pulling him forward. They had already seen something that they weren't supposed to, so why not take the next step and figure it out for themselves? Over the next few days, Toby and Tina started to gather information. They spent hours researching on the internet, watching videos and reading articles that seemed to explain what they had seen. They came across a lot of confusing terms and images, none of which made complete sense to them. But the more they searched, the more they began to understand the words and ideas that seemed to explain what they had witnessed in their parents' room. Tina felt uneasy about everything they were learning. Some of it seemed too complicated, too grown up. But Toby was eager to keep going. He couldn't stop himself from wanting to know more, from wanting to feel like he was in control of his own understanding. The mystery that had been planted in his mind was starting to grow, and now it felt like an obsession. One afternoon, when they were alone in the house, Toby found an article that explained in simple words what they had seen. It didn't feel as strange as it had the first time. It made more sense now. Toby looked at Tina, his eyes wide with excitement. "Tina, I think I get it now," he said, his voice full of wonder. "I think it's something that people do when they really love each other. It's not so bad, I guess. It's just a part of growing up." Tina looked at him, still unsure. "But we're not grown-ups, Toby. We don't know what it really means." Toby paused, his eyes flicking back to the screen. "I think we do. We just didn't understand it before. But now we do." Without thinking too much about the consequences, Toby turned to Tina and said, "Let's try again. We'll do it right this time, like what we read. It won't be weird, I promise." Tina felt a cold chill run through her. She didn't want to, but the pressure of her brother's insistence and the weight of their shared secret made it hard to say no. She didn't want to be the one who stopped it, who held them back from understanding. So, reluctantly, she agreed. Once again they tried to replicate what they had seen. But this time it felt even worse. The more they attempted, the more they realized how wrong it all was. It wasn't like the games they played, it wasn't fun or exciting. It was uncomfortable, confusing, and strange. They both stopped at the same moment, realizing that they had crossed a line they weren't ready for. The whole experiment had backfired. They didn't feel like they had found answers. They only felt more lost. The weight of guilt settled in their chests, heavier than before. They looked at each other, and for the first time since the incident, they saw the hurt in each other's eyes. They were both scared, confused, and ashamed of what they had just done. Before either of them could speak, the door to their room opened and their mother stepped inside. Her expression was not one of anger, but of quiet disappointment. She had known something wasn't right and she had been watching them closely. "Toby." "Tina," she said gently. "We need to talk." Toby's heart sank and Tina's face turned pale. The conversation they had been avoiding, the one they both feared, was finally happening. And it was too late to turn back. The room was heavy with tension as Mrs. Adebayo stood in the doorway, looking at her children. There was no anger in her eyes, just a deep, sorrowful sadness that made Toby and Tina feel like their world was unraveling. She stepped forward and sat down on the bed, motioning for them to join her. Neither of them moved at first. They were paralyzed with guilt, ashamed of the choices they had made. Toby's heart was pounding in his chest. He had been so determined to understand, to figure it out, but now as he looked at his mother's face, he realized how wrong it had all been. He should have listened to her when she warned them. He should have stopped when he had the chance. But the curiosity had been too strong. Tina, sitting beside her brother, didn't dare to look up. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, her hands tightly clutching her knees. She felt like she was about to break, like she couldn't hide from the truth anymore. "Do you know why I'm upset?" Mrs. Adebayo asked softly, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling within her. "It's not because you were curious or because you wanted to understand. I get that. But what you've done goes beyond curiosity and it goes beyond understanding. You've taken something that's meant for adults and you've tried to make it something for yourselves." Toby and Tina sat in silence, their minds racing but not knowing how to respond. Mrs. Adebayo continued, her words cutting through the air. "When you saw your father and me in our private moment, you didn't just see an act between two people who love each other. You saw something that was not meant for your eyes, and now it's made everything else complicated. I know you didn't mean any harm, but what you've done has crossed a line, one that I hoped you wouldn't ever have to experience this early in your lives." Toby felt like the weight of the world had just fallen on his shoulders. It was as though he could feel his innocence slipping away, piece by piece, with each word his mother said. He thought they could fix things, that they could figure it out themselves, but now he realized just how far gone they were. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Toby whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted to know." Mrs. Adebayo nodded, her face softening. "I know you didn't mean to hurt anyone, sweetheart. But some things are for adults to figure out. You're still children. You don't need to carry the weight of this kind of knowledge yet." Tina finally spoke, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to do it, Mom. But Toby said we should." Mrs. Adebayo's eyes flickered with understanding. I know. And I know you trusted your brother. But Tina, you need to remember that you don't always have to follow what others say. It's okay to say no. You're allowed to set your own boundaries even with the people you love. The words stung. They stung because they were true. Tina had known something didn't feel right, but her desire to be close to her brother, to fit in with what he was doing, had overridden her instincts. He felt like she had let him down in some way. The room fell silent once again, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. Toby and Tina exchanged a brief glance, both feeling a deep sense of loss. They had crossed a threshold they couldn't undo, and now the rift between them and their parents felt wider than ever. It wasn't just the incident they had witnessed, it was everything that had followed. The trust that had been broken, the things that couldn't be unseen, and the realization that they were no longer the innocent children they once were. We've all made mistakes, Toby. Tina, Mrs. Adebayo said gently, her voice cracking slightly. But it's important that we learn from them. And it's important that we rebuild the trust we've lost. I love you both more than anything in this world. But this is something we need to work through together. Toby, feeling the sting of her words, nodded slowly. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just wanted to know what it was. Mrs. Adebayo reached out and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. I know. But sometimes it's better to wait, to be patient, and to trust that there's time for all of us to grow into the people we're meant to be. As her words sunk in, a flood of emotions overwhelmed Toby. He felt a mixture of sadness, confusion, and regret. His childhood had been shattered by his own curiosity, and now there was no going back. The innocence he had once taken for granted was gone. And what hurt the most was the way his parents now looked at him, not with the same love and joy they had once shared, but with a mixture of disappointment and concern. Tina, sitting beside him, could feel the same weight in her heart. She missed the way things used to be, the carefree days of playing with toys, laughing without a care in the world. She missed the feeling of safety and security, knowing that nothing in the world could hurt her. But now everything had changed. Their parents had become distant. The home no longer felt like the sanctuary it once was. The bond that had once held their family together was now frayed and fragile. After a long moment, Mrs. Adebayo stood up and turned toward the door. I'm going to give you both some time to think about this, she said quietly. We'll talk more tomorrow when we've all had a chance to calm down. Just remember that I love you both and we'll figure this out. Together. As she left the room, the silence that followed was deafening. Toby and Tina sat together in the dim light, the weight of their actions hanging heavy on their hearts. They had tried to understand something they weren't ready for, and now they had to face the consequences. Toby's eyes filled with tears as he looked at Tina. He couldn't help it, everything felt too much to bear. What if things never go back to the way they were? He whispered, his voice cracking. Tina shook her head, her own tears slipping down her cheeks. I don't know, Toby. I don't know. They sat in silence, their hearts aching with the same bitter realization. The world they once knew had changed forever and nothing would ever be the same again. The innocence of their childhood was lost, and the path ahead seemed uncertain. But one thing was clear. Their family, the one they had once thought was unbreakable, was now fractured. And no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't undo what had been done. And as the night stretched on, Toby and Tina were left to grapple with the feelings of loss, confusion, and mistrust that would follow them for a long time.